This video is going to cover the installation of the Field Racing Billet dipstick. Field Racing Billet dipstick is both O-ringed as well as threaded. And the reason we went with a threaded O-ring dipstick is quite simply to keep the crankcase vapors where they belong. Now, in force induction applications, as well as other NA applications where you don't have proper PCV ventilation, you can run into situations where the crankcase pressures force the dipstick out of the dipstick tube, spraying oil, mist, and vapor all over your hot exhaust manifold or turbo manifold, creating a severe fire hazard. So we simply made a threaded O-ring dipstick so that's not an issue. The dipstick itself is quite simple to use. You just can back out the threads. The dipstick will come out of the dipstick tube. It is a stainless steel cable type dipstick. The end of the dipstick has a crimp. The top of the crimp fitting will indicate your full oil level mark. The bottom of the crimp will indicate 1 quart low. The dipstick simply will slide back into the dipstick tube and you can thread it back into place. Now, before I go on to the installation of the dipstick itself, I want to point out one important thing. And that is, if you had an engine with a block mounted dipstick, you're going to have a hole in the engine where that block mounted dipstick was. Most newer engines are all going to have a sump mounted dipstick, so that plug will have already been included in the block from the factory. But again, if you had a block mounted dipstick, you're going to want to get that OEM plug and install it before installing your engine, as it's just much easier to get to. Now, all that plug is a 3/8 freeze plug. You can go to a parts store, get a 3/8 freeze plug, or you can go to the dealership. They're only like $2.30 at the dealership. Either way, make sure that you take care of that before installing the engine. I'm going to point out a couple things that only apply to the 350Z and 370Z kits, and that is the starter. With any of the other applications, it doesn't matter what starter you use, but with the 350 and 370Z applications, you're going to want to use a new short body GM OEM starter, or you're going to want to use a high torque mini starter. I really prefer the high torque mini starters, especially if you're going to go force induction, as it allows plenty of room to get to both your oil return fitting as well as your dipstick bung. Moving on from that, I also want to cover that we do have several sump locations, and for each of those sump locations you can simply route your dipstick really where you prefer. For the rear sump, I go between these two runners. For front sump, I go to the very front bolt on the header flange, but you can really route it anywhere you'd like. The dipstick will come with an included clamp that will allow you to mount it to any of the studs along the header. You can use, if you're not running AC, the AC locations, whatever you prefer for your application. To install the dipstick, simply remove your quarter MPT to -6 mil fitting, install thread tape, thread sealant, whatever you prefer, install it into your sump, go ahead and tighten that all the way down. At this point, you're going to decide what orientation you would like the logo, whether you want it parallel to the head, perpendicular, or anywhere in between. Once you've decided that, simply install the dipstick, tighten the tube nut down to the -6 mil, while holding it in the orientation which you prefer. As you tighten that down, just get it nice and snug on the 37-degree seat. Then you can come in and form your dipstick. This one's been formed, obviously, but it's just annealed aluminum, so the dipsticks bend quite simply, very easy. Just make a nice shallow bend. No real tight bends, obviously. But at any rate, once you have it where you prefer and the orientation of the logo is correct, you can go ahead and tighten that bottom tube nut down, and then just simply install your band clamp, and that takes care of that.